to Farmercon VI.
Are these all on? Hello? Thank you. Hello? Hi there. Okay. All right, well, welcome to Farmercon VI, and thank you guys for all staying so late. Welcome to the presentation part of Farmercon. My name is Michael Croteau. I'm the webmaster of pjfarmer.com, Phil Farmer's official website. From 2005 to 2009, I published a fanzine about him called Farmer File. Right now, I'm currently editing the Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer anthologies, and me and Wynn and Paul Spiteri, who couldn't be here, run these Farmercons every once a summer, and I'm really sad Paul's not here because he's sort of the center of our little social group, which is really inconvenient because he lives in England. So, and I really want to say thank you to the really kind people here at Pulpfest for not only letting us crash their party, letting us be in their program, but just they've been wonderfully gracious and helpful all along, and maybe we'll come back and do this again. So before we get going with our speakers, who are going to cover a variety of topics, I'm going to give you a brief history of Farmercon and how we came to be here at Pulpfest. And 5 minutes from now, if you start getting bored, please don't leave. I promise they'll be much more entertaining. And 5 minutes from now, I'll be this close to being done. So this picture you see here is actually from Farmercon II, and that is right outside Phil Farmer's house. That's Phil sitting in the wheelchair, and his wife Betty's right behind him. There's a whole bunch of fans that came. Joe Lansdale was there, but he had left before we did this. On the far left there, Haney, Peace Out, and then Gary Wolf, and then Hans Peace Out. Hans and Haney actually came from Denmark. And they've been to 3 of them, I think. They came all the way to Seattle last year. And just fans come from all over the world to these Farmercons, these gatherings. If you want to go ahead and hit the next one. Even though this is Farmercon VI, and we've done these 6 straight years, the history of Farmercon actually begins in the spring of 2001, when Phil Farmer won the Science Fiction Writers of America's Grand Master Award. And he lives in Peoria, Illinois, and the local library there that he's been very active with over the years had a living legend reception for him. And Maggie Nelson, the lady you see on the far right of the picture, was the public relations director for the Peoria Public Library, and Phil gave her my name. She called me up and told me about this reception they were going to have, and I went onto my then unofficial website and spread the word and let people know, and it wasn't just a local crowd. We had people come. I don't know if anybody came from outside the country, but we had people from West Virginia, California, Texas, just all over the country came for this. And my I'm sorry, I'll slow down a little bit. Okay. And we had a great time. The farmers knew everybody was coming. We had, similar to this, we weren't involved yet. I wasn't involved, and it was actually local competitions. Ray LaHood, he was supposed to be there. He sent an assistant. I think he's a senator or a representative now, but he was a state legislator at the time. Proclaimed that day to be Philip Jose Farmer Day. And Phil, who didn't speak a lot in public, just sort of peeked up and went and said, "So I'm not getting a street named after me?" Very dry sense of humor he had. But the idea was all this stuff happened at the library, and then 3 or 4 hours later we were going to go out to dinner, and Betty Farmer, Phil's wife, asked me what everybody was doing for the next few hours, and I said, "Nothing, we're just going to go back to our hotel and crash and rest." And she said, no, just have everybody come over to the house. And this was like 30 people that I had gotten to come from across the country. And so Phil actually stayed upstairs, and we all went down to the basement. I think you can hit the next slide. And got to see many of his books, many of the, you don't see all, but a fraction here, original artwork he owned, cover paintings, interiors. He had a Virgil Finley from one of his first stories in Science Fiction Plus. Just I mean, we were just like kids in a candy store. We were just taking pictures of each other standing next to paintings and stuff. It was a blast. So that just really made the day special for everybody. And that's what Phil and Betty were all about. Phil was the kindest, most gracious person you can imagine. I was a fan the first time I called him up, and I was so nervous. I said, "I'm very bothered to sorry you," and he just rolled with it and told him I had a web page, and I sent him a printout because he wasn't online at the time. This was 1995 or 6, and I was just sort of showing off. Look, I've got a list of all your books and a list of all your stories and where they were published, and sent him 20 pages, and he sent it back to me covered in handwritten corrections. So I now know how to spell Putnam correctly, and so I've made all those corrections, and I've added to it, obviously, over the years. But they had such a great time, and Betty Farmer was always the life of the party. Phil was guest of honor at conventions for 30 years, all over the country, all over the world, and Betty just loved going to these conventions, meeting, hanging out with Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, and going to the Playboy Mansion and doing all these things. So she called me up about 6 months after this and said, "So let's do it again." It's like, are they going to give him another Grand Master? I'm not sure what to do, but we realized it was 2002, and it was the 50th anniversary of Phil's story, The Lovers. So an author named Tracy Knight, really, really sweet guy, really good writer, who doesn't write enough, was a member of the Science Fiction Writers of America, so he delved into his directory and contacted a whole bunch of writers and said, "It's the 50th anniversary of Phil's story, The Lovers. If you would please write a little letter or tribute to Phil about the story, about the fact that the library is having a celebration." And we, get the next slide. Is that reverse? So it's normal. Okay. We again did another thing at the library. This time the fans were more involved. It wasn't the local politicians. And gave him a plaque for the day, and he came out and he brought the Hugo that he had won, which wasn't actually called the Hugo back then in '53, for the most promising talent, new talent, for basically for the Lovers. Go ahead and hit the next one. Okay, there's the crowd. Similar to this, we packed the room. It was standing room only. A bunch of fans came from all over the country. Go ahead and hit the next one. And we actually printed a program with all of the letters that all of these authors had written, as well as every letter I could find from October 1952 all the way through '55, when Startling Stories and Thrilling Wonder Stories went out of business, that mentioned the Lovers. Because people wrote in letters about this story for 3 years, until it got to the point where it was just a measuring stick. People were like, "Oh, that story was good, but it was no Lovers." And I included all of them, and there were letters from Forey Ackerman and Marion Zimmer Bradley and John Bruner and Theodore Sturgeon. I mean, it was really a big deal, as I think most people know when the story came out. And there's a Harlan Ellison collector here that knows that there was also a tribute Harlan had written to Phil the year prior when he won the Grand Master. He let us reprint in that program, as well as all the new letters. And we printed that as a program and handed it out. And that was sort of a tradition we started to everybody who came to the library, printed up 50 or 100 and just gave those out for free. Go ahead and go to the next one. And that kind of became the modus operandi. We would print a program, and these next two, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. We did that in 2002, and then we didn't do anything for 3 years, and Betty kept saying, "Come on, let's do something, let's have a party, there's got to be a reason for you guys to come." And Paul Spiteri, the guy from England, said, "Well, we're coming over with my wife and 2 daughters, we're going to be in the States for a couple weeks. Why don't we just have a bunch of people come?" We started publishing Farmer File, the magazine of Philip Jose Farmer. Let's get all of the writers and artists and invite them up, and we'll just do a thing at the library, and we'll do a thing at the house. And so that's how Farmercon started. And we actually wrote up, I think the first one there had 3 con reports, which were written ahead of time, which is always a neat trick, by characters of Phil's. And I won't say who actually wrote those. It wasn't me. And then Farmercon 2 was I think we had a bunch of letters from Phil's characters who were apologizing that they wouldn't be able to make the Farmercon this year. So we just had fun with it. These are things we gave out for free. They're not collector's items. Somewhere in here, which I haven't been reading at all. You can go to the next one. Then we started actually spending a little money and printing them in color. And Farmercon 3, we actually call it Farmercon 90 because Phil turned 90 that year. And I think that was the last year that Phil actually came out to the library and saw the presentations and signed some books and stuff. Farmercon 4 was in 2009. That was the memorial service. Basically, that was our public memorial and goodbye. Some of us had actually gone to Phil's funeral in February 2009, but this was in June. Betty Farmer insisted that we still have a Farmercon. She still wanted the party in February and in March, and then she got sicker and sicker, and so by the time we had Farmercon 4 in June, we still had everything at the library. Betty couldn't come, but we went to the house, had the party as always, and she actually passed away, I think, 3 days later. So it was great that we all got to see her one last time and say goodbye. Obviously, Phil, a lot of us actually went up in January for his birthday and saw him about a month before he passed away in February. I've totally not read anything off of here, so I don't know where I am. Now, the programs had all kinds of great stuff. I already talked about that. So, one thing we talked to Phil and Betty about was continuing with Farmercon after they were gone, and maybe taking it on the road and going to different places, because in Peoria, by the time we did Farmercon 4, we weren't getting the local walk-ins, we weren't getting the crowd, they'd all seen it and done it. And so last year you can go to the next slide, we went to Seattle and had Farmercon there the weekend of the Locust Awards Hall of Fame induction ceremony. And just happened that not a month before that, I was going through Phil's files, which I currently am the holder of what we call the magic filing cabinet, because every time I open the boxes and go through them, I find something I didn't find the last 13 times I went through it. I found a tribute that Phil had written to Roger Zelazny that was obviously for an anthology, because it said at the end, it says, read these stories and you'll see just how wonderful they are. And it was never printed anywhere. Roger wrote 3 or 4 tributes to Phil that appeared in his books, but Phil, as far as anybody knew, and I contacted several Zelazny collectors and experts, and they had no knowledge of this whatsoever. So Phil's agent was kind enough to let us print it in the Farmercon 5 program that we gave out for free at Farmercon 5 last year in Seattle. And so after that, we kind of hoped Phil would get into the Hall of Fame. For some reason, he's not in the Hall of Fame there in Seattle, which is kind of ridiculous. But we're now looking each year for a different location, and Pulpfest was by far the most attractive thing. We like the type of crowd, the people who actually read books and don't stand in the corners talking about Doctor Who all the time, which I love Doctor Who, but I'd rather read my science fiction than watch my science fiction. So we're very grateful that Pulpfest was so accommodating and invited us, happily to come along here and hold Farmercon. And one thing I was going to say is that this is the presentation of part of Farmercon, but for us, Farmercon is getting together and talking. Last night, Wynn and I and John Small were in the hospitality suite until our wives came and found us and told us it was time to go to bed. So just, we communicate with email and Facebook all the time, but just to sit and talk and throw story ideas back and forth, that's really the main reason we're getting together and doing this year after year. And by the way, we did not print a program this year, but we do have 4 pages in the back of the Pulpster. So you guys can see there are 3 excerpts from stories from The Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer 2, which is coming out in about 3 weeks. If you buy it here, I'll ship it to you for free at my expense. And that's it. And nobody left the room while I was rambling on. That's fantastic. So now here we are, and our first speaker who's going to give you the goods on Phil Farmer and really make you nostalgic for him is Wayne Eckert. He's a Wold Newton expert and the co-author with Phil Farmer of The Evil in Pemberley House, which I'm sure will pop up here at some point, Mr. Wayne Scott Eckert. Pulling up his PowerPoint now.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? All right. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to talk tonight about the Wold Newton Universe, which is Phil's basically universe of pulp heroes. So it's pretty apropos for this convention. First of all, thank you everybody for not leaving, despite the fact that it's so late, and staying and listening. We really appreciate it. So what you're looking at here is the cover for Myths for the Modern Age, which is a collection of essays written by both Phil Farmer and by his followers. And they're written in the genre of sort of the mock biography genre. So Phil wrote two mock biographies, Tarzan Alive and Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life. These are essays that continue in that genre, sort of treating fictional characters as if they were real and as if they all interacted together. This was the first book that I put out. Obviously, Phil authorized it and actually came out before I had a chance to meet Phil in person. But I did meet Phil in person very shortly after this book came out. I met him for the first time over the 4th of July weekend in 2005. So quite late in his life, but I got to go and visit with Phil several times between 2005 and 2009 before he passed away. That particular trip obviously was an amazing trip for me in 2005. There were two singular events that came out of that particular trip. One, Phil and Betty invited me sight unseen. They didn't know if I had, 4 heads and 5 ears or whatever, but they invited me to stay at their house. So I get to sleep in their guest bedroom, and like Mike said, look at all the books and the posters and the paintings, and also was privileged to go into the back room with Mike and look through the magic filing cabinet, as we call it. And that's where I found an unfinished manuscript that Phil had started in the early 1970s. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later and what they allowed me to do with that. The other momentous thing about that trip was that in coming out of said guest bedroom at about 2 a.m. to use the facilities, I set off their burglar alarm. But they still had me back.
I wondered if you were going to mention that.
Yeah, I couldn't resist. They were very gracious. All right. Okay, so Philip Jose Farmer is a biographer. He's a biographer of real people. Tarzan and Doc Savage were real people. This is an illustration from my website, the Wold Newton Universe website, done by my wife, who is asleep 1 floor below us, and I don't blame her. But this is the first Wold Newton website that came onto the internet in 1997, and it still has that vintage 1997 look and feel. So go check it out, because I have not updated the design at all. I have not had time for that. Okay, so celebrated science fiction author, 3-time Hugo Award winner, Nebula Award, famous award. Mike's mentioned The Lovers, River World, obviously, the World of Tears series, an amazing series, and then the Wold Newton cycle of biographies, essays, novels, and short stories. So the Wold Newton family, it all started in Wold Newton, England, in Yorkshire, in the East Riding of Yorkshire, on December 13th, 1795, when a meteor struck in that very small village. You can see a picture of the meteor on the right hand. On the left hand is a photograph of a monument which was erected at the spot where the meteor hit 4 years later, in 1799, by the landholder of that area, Edward Topham. So it says, on this spot, December 13, 1795, fell from the atmosphere an extraordinary stone in breadth 28 inches and length 30 inches, and whose weight was 56 pounds. This column in memory of it was erected by Edward Topham, 1799. So some people who follow the Wold Newton mythology and the continuity ask me, did this really happen? Was this meteor strike real? Because, the premise of that question is that everything else is not real, Tarzan and Doc Savage. So that's a faulty premise. But yes, the meteor strike really happened. And there are myself, Paul Spiteri, who Mike mentioned, and Mike at the Wold Newton Monument 2 years ago, and pretty much almost exactly 2 years ago. I think it was July 21st, so we're pretty close. So Mike and I went to England and spent about 2 weeks in England 2 years ago and made the circuit and did all sorts of neat things, like going to the Sherlock Holmes Museum and all sorts of other neat Wold Newton things. And we went up to Wold Newton in Yorkshire to see where the meteor hit. Then we circled back around, hit back London again, and actually got to see the Wold Newton meteor itself. It was actually not on display at the time at the Wold Newton, or at the London Natural History Museum, but they made a special meeting for us. We had a special appointment, went down to the basement. They pulled it out for us, and we got to take lots of pictures and hold fragments of it. You can't touch it because the oil of your skin could damage it, but they did give us some shards, and we had to put on gloves. So there's, this is me as a fanboy, right? I'm getting excited about a rock that fell from the sky, taking pictures of it. And then over on the right is another photograph, and you can see in the background the folks at the History Museum have a bottle of bitter there. That's Falling Stone bitter, which is actually from the Wold Top Brewery in Wold Newton. So there's a whole series of beers now. Okay, so what is the Wold Newton family? The premise is that when the meteor came down, there were some coach passengers going by who were exposed to the ionization of the radiation of the meteor. And essentially what happened is these folks then intermarried, as people were wont to do, and there's a whole host of descendants of the people who were at this event when the meteor came down. And we're very familiar with those people, with those descendants. We're also familiar with some of the people who were actually there. So John Clayton, the third Duke of Greystoke, was there, a progenitor of Tarzan. Sir Percy Blakeney and his second wife were there. Sir Percy Blakeney was the Scarlet Pimpernel, who had just been rescuing people from the terror in France several years before. Fitzwilliam Darcy and his wife Elizabeth Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. A couple of folks who were progenitors of Professor Challenger from Doyle's The Lost World. Some ancestors of Hugh Bulldog Drummond. Dr. Seeger Holmes and his wife, obviously related to Sherlock Holmes. And then some more ancestors of Bulldog Drummond. And then there were also some coachmen. Louis Lupin, an ancestor of Arsène Lupin, Albert Lecoq, an ancestor of the famous French detective Monsieur Lecoq, and Arthur Blake, ancestor of British detective Sexton Blake. So these families intermarried in the following generations and reinforced the gene and produced what Phil called a nova of genetic splendor, this outburst of great detectives and scientists and explorers of exotic worlds, this last efflorescence of true heroes in an otherwise degenerate age. So you've got Sherlock Holmes, the Scarlet Pimpernel, Captain Nemo, Phileas Fogg, Wells's time traveler, Tarzan. You've got some, people who kind of skirt the other side of the law too, like Raffles. And Arsène Lupin. You've got Professor Challenger, Richard Hannay, Sir Dennis Nayland Smith, who was the nemesis of Fu Manchu. The Shadow, G8, Sam Spade, Doc Savage, and Pat Savage. Monk Mayfair. The Spider, Nero Wolfe, the Avenger, Richard Henry Benson, the Avenger. Philip Marlowe, James Bond. All of these folks are members of the family tree, and he actually constructed the family tree. So you've got Fu Manchu, Professor Moriarty, and Carl Peterson, who is Bulldog Drummond's archenemy as well. Earlier influences on Phil's concepts were other speculative articles that really arose out of Sherlock Holmes fandom. So, as you probably know, folks who read the Sherlock Holmes books and are really very passionate about them say that Holmes was a real person, that Watson truly wrote them, and that Conan Doyle was only the editor, and then Watson made mistakes in the canon on purpose because he was concealing identities of real people and so forth. And that's how they reconcile some of the inconsistency in the stories. And this is sort of a trope that continues through this whole genre of speculative essays and articles and mock biographies. So Phil was very influenced by this. And then there were links to other fictional characters. So there were other speculators had postulated that Nero Wolfe was the son of Sherlock Holmes, and H.W. Starr continued to expand the connections to Tarzan. So Phil built on this. There were other earlier fictional biographies. So there was a fictional biography of the Scarlet Pimpernel. There were fictional biographies of Sherlock Holmes and of Nero Wolfe by the scholar William S. Baring-Gould. So Phil took all of this together as he built his own fictional biography of his favorite heroic character, Tarzan. So Tarzan Alive came out in 1972. Here are various different cover scans from various editions of that. The one on the right is the most recent edition, 2006 edition from Bison Books. So here is the genealogical chart that I mentioned. So, he did, immense research on this to make sure that the timelines fit, that the chronologies fit, that two people who he said were married or got together really could have done so in that correct time period. So if you go back and do and sort of review his research, it's pretty amazing. And then his second biography was of his other greatest heroic influence, Doc Savage. And here we have several different cover scans of Doc Savage, his apocalyptic life. The latest version is the one on the far right, which is the 1981 Playboy paperback edition. So unfortunately, this book has been out of print for far too long, but we are working on that. And then here's the chart, the Wold Newton Family chart from that book. So both charts taken together, and there are relationships between the two charts, both charts taken together comprise Phil's vision of the Wold Newton family of heroes. So after he wrote his mock biographies, he actually started writing fiction set in this continuity. And again, these were fictionalizations of real historical events because it's all true. So The Adventure of the Fearless Peer, The Lord of the Jungle, meets Sherlock Holmes during the Great War. We also have The Other Log of Phileas Fogg, which basically is the secret history of Around the World in 80 Days, the truth behind Verne's novel, what was really happening during that novel. Phil was also very fortunate to actually be able to write authorized entries in the series about his two childhood heroes. So he wrote an official Doc Savage novel, Escape from Loki, which was about young Doc Savage during the latter days of the Great War in 1918. And then he was allowed to write an official Tarzan novel, also The Dark Heart of Time, also taking place in 1918. And he also wrote other speculative articles and other speculative short stories after King Kong fell, in which Doc Savage and the Shadow make cameo appearances, unnamed, because those were, he was respecting copyright in those. The Problem of the Sore Bridge, which is a Sherlock Holmes and Raffles crossover. So going beyond Phil's work, Western writer J.T. Edson incorporated his farmer's concepts into his own fiction. In 1980s, there were farmer-esque speculative articles written by other writers that appeared in pulp fanzines, most notably by our friend Rick Wag here, who is going to also give a speculative presentation. But Rick was, without a doubt, the most prolific speculative Farmerian writer at that time, and actually still is, and has several books out collecting his essays, which are excellent. And then I launched my website in 1997. Jean-Marc Lofficier, a French science fiction writer, launched his in 1999. Myths for the Modern Age came out, as I mentioned, in 2005. My books, Crossovers 1 and 2, which are basically a massive timeline of this universe, came out in 2 volumes last year. There have been a series of anthologies called Tales of the Shadowmen, which have crossover fiction involving many heroes which can be linked into this universe. That's been a yearly release since 2005. And then starting in 2009, there was an authorized Wold Newton novel. Authorized short fiction began in 2010 in Meteor House's The Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer series, and collaborations with Farmer. So I already talked about Myths for the Modern Age, so we'll skip over that. The books Crossovers that I mentioned, these are massive timelines that basically add to the Wold Newton family concept and expand it into a universe. So not every character that is added is actually a member of the genetic family, but through a 6 degrees of separation sort of linkage, these characters can be shown to exist in the same continuity. There are well over 1,000 different crossover story entries in this timeline, linking in different various characters, from some of the most obvious crossovers that you might think of to some extremely obscure crossovers. Copies are available at the Meteor House table downstairs. Published by Blackcoat Press in 2 volumes last year. So these are just, these will be very quick, just a quick sampling of the type of crossover stories that we're talking about. So Sherlock Holmes is a member of the Wold Newton family. He battled Dr. Fu Manchu in Kay Van Ash's authorized Fu Manchu novel, 10 Years Beyond Baker Street. Therefore, that story takes place in the overall Wold Newton continuity. Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula, if you're a purist in terms of the Holmesian canon, that you probably don't buy that Holmes battled Dracula, but if you like to play with the conventions a little bit, then this might be acceptable to you. Sherlock Holmes' War of the Worlds by Manly Wade Wellman and his son Wade Wellman. Sherlock Holmes versus Arsène Lupin. So Maurice Leblanc, way back in the early 1900s, wrote Arsène Lupin versus Herlock Sholmes, and Rick is the expert in this area. He can probably tell you that Conan Doyle did not respond very favorably, but nonetheless, these stories have remained available and recently reprinted by Blackcoat Press, as you can see by the scan in the middle. And then we have Sherlock Holmes in a series of short stories involving the Lovecraftian and the Cthulhu mythos, Shadows over Baker Street. Holmes and Doctor Who. Dr. Holmes, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Holmes. If any of you are comic book fans of Warren from the late 70s and early 80s, Sherlock Holmes, and their time-traveling hero, the Rook, who was said to be related to Wells's time traveler. You probably heard of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Hopefully you've heard of it through the 2 graphic novels by Alan Moore, and maybe not so much from the film. So this is a scan of the artwork from the first League of Extraordinary Gentlemen crossover. Pardon me.
And Wayne, just out of curiosity, there are crossovers that don't include Sherlock Holmes, correct?
Oh yeah, we're getting to them.
Just wanted everybody to know that.
So go ahead.
Also, Alan Moore, I don't think would consider his work part of the lot.
He probably wouldn't, but since we're doing metafiction here, we can kind of make it up. So Alan Quatermain, Captain Nemo, Mina Murray from Dracula, The Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll, Professor Moriarty, Fu Manchu, Mycroft Holmes can be shown to link in through this. All right, so additional heroic crossovers. Conan and Solomon Kane, through the joys of time travel, mystical time travel, had an adventure together. And you might think, well, wait a minute, the Wold Newton family started in 1795. What does Conan have to do with this? But the idea here is that the Wold Newton family certainly started in 1795, but this is a universe, and it has a prehistory, and it has a far future. And so Conan can exist in the ancient prehistory of this universe. Dave Stevens, the original Rocketeer comic series that he did, probably my all-time favorite comic, features cameo by Doc Savage and the Amazing Five. There's a scan of from that in the middle. And then the second series features a cameo, again disguised due to copyright, of the Shadow. So you can see the Shadow up on the top right there in his Lamont Cranston guise. All right, more heroic crossover. So here's another scan of a different edition of Phil Farmer's The Peerless Peer. In the middle, we have the Shadow and Doc Savage, a cover by Dave Stevens, again, one of my favorite comics / pulp-influenced artists. And then Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. Tarzan and Pellucidar. So here's Edgar Rice Burroughs himself mixing up two of his own series and crossing them over. Another Shadow and Doc Savage from DC Comics. And then a Shadow and the Avenger, Richard Henry Benson, from the first run of the Shadow comics back in the 1970s. Zorro versus Dracula. In the middle, here's H. Rider Haggard crossing over two of his series. So Asha, otherwise known as She, and Alan Quatermain. And then another Phil Farmer novel. This is a different scan of the other log of Phileas Fogg. Comic books, certainly getting into the mix here. So Shadow and Batman, Doc Savage and Spider-Man, Sherlock Holmes and Batman. And Holmes is quite elderly by this time, but we do know that he had the royal jelly elixir, so that helped preserve him a little bit. Doc Savage and The Thing from the Fantastic Four. King Kull and Spider-Man, Tarzan and Batman. Green Hornet and Batman, if you like your Batman with an Adam West flavor. And Red Sonja and Spider-Man. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but again, I mentioned Tales of the Shadowmen. It's an annual anthology of crossover pastiche stories. And basically these types of stories fall into several categories. Stories that are actually licensed by the holders of the original rights. So, for instance, Tarzan and Batman, that was a licensed crossover. Public domain, where no one has to get any permission, so Sherlock Holmes and Dracula. And then hidden or disguised due to copyright and trademark issues. So some of you may have been at my reading today for my second Avengers story, and there were lots of crossover references in that. They were all disguised. They're by description, sort of, if you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, who that is by the description, you can get it. If you don't pick up on that particular little trick, then the story still makes sense for you. Most of the Tales of the Shadowmen stories neatly fit into this continuity. And here's just some cover scans of the various Tales of the Shadowmen books. Again, these are edited by French science fiction writer and editor Jean-Marc Lafayette, and the imprint is Black Code Press. All right, so new Wold Newton novels. So this is a cover scan of The Evil in Pemberley House. This is the unfinished manuscript that I found in the magic filing cabinet on my very first visit to Phil Farmer's house and his basement. And Mike can probably, tell you about the very strange sounds emanating from the basement when I found this. Whoops of joy, cries of disbelief that this possibly could have existed.
And I'd never read Jane Austen at the time, so I had no idea what Pemberley House was. So it just flew right over my head what he was so excited about.
So yeah, the file was named Pemberley House, which definitely intrigued me since since Darcy and Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice were at the Wold Newton event, so I knew Phil was thinking something by naming this file Pemberley House. And when I looked at it, the very first page of the manuscript read, "A nightmare, Patricia thought." So Patricia, right? Patricia, Pat Savage, right? I knew this was a Doc Savage. I knew there was something to do with Doc Savage. And I was right. So this is a Gothic-styled novel, plays on the Gothic conventions, takes place in the early 1970s, and it's about Patricia Wildman, Doc Savage's daughter. In the Doc Savage biography that he wrote, Farmer said that Doc Savage's real name was Dr. James Clark Wildman. So that was his real last name, Wildman. So the character name is Patricia Wildman. She inherits Pemberley House, and she goes to England to take advantage of her inheritance. There are various nasty people there who don't wish her to inherit, and the action goes from there. There's also a lot of Sherlockian background, a Sherlock Holmes candy background in this novel. And Phil was extremely gracious. He had stopped writing by this time on the basis of the fact that I had done some short fiction. He allowed me to finish the outline, to flesh out the outline, because he had written several chapters and then had an outline of the rest of it. He allowed me to flesh out the outline. He approved of what I had done, and then I sent him several chapters at a time as I finished it for his approval until the book was done. So on the left is a cover scan of the chapbook that came with the limited edition for the Evil in Pemberley House. And this is significant because what you see here is the Doc Savage coat of arms. So Phil was a great fan of heraldry, and he had actually done the Greystoke coat of arms for Tarzan, but he had only described the Doc Savage coat of arms in writing. He had never actually had it completed by an artist. So we found some notes of his and fleshed it out a little bit, made some additions to it. Again, the additions came from Phil. They had just never been published. And so we completed the Doc Savage coat of arms. And then on the other side are just some scans about some of the influences in the Pemberley House novel. And then here we have The Man of Bronze, Doc Savage from the first paperback art. And on the right we have Keith Howell's depiction of Doc's daughter, Patricia Wildman. So in the tradition of doing new Wold Newton novels, we're also pleased to announce here, and it has been announced online, that there will be a completion of the third novel in the series that was started by the books Haddon of Ancient Opar and Flight to Opar. So these novels take place in the ancient prehistory of Lord Greystoke, the Jungle Lord's world. And Phil wrote these first two books, and they came out in the mid-1970s. He wrote part of the third novel and outlined it, but it was obviously he never completed it. He gave permission to my good friend and colleague Christopher Paul Carey to finish this book, and the third book will be published in approximately spring 2012 in an omnibus by Subterranean Press. The omnibus does not have a title yet. And it's basically the conclusion to this trilogy. So they take place in the prehistoric Africa of the Wold Newton Universe. The connection here is that the character Sahindar, who is the gray-eyed god, who occasionally makes appearances in this ancient world, is really a time traveler who was seen in Phil's other novel called Time's Last Gift. So in Time's Last Gift, a character, an immortal character with gray eyes, who has much physical prowess and is highly intelligent, goes back in time and has an adventure back in time and actually stays back in time. Readers of Time's Last Gift may have made the connection that this time traveler is a very well-known jungle lord. And so this jungle lord, time traveler character, then becomes Sahindar and makes occasional appearances in the two Opar books. And he just might appear in The Song of Quasin, which is the third book coming out next year. Here's an illustration by Keith Howell from a fragment of The Song of Quasin, which appeared in Farmer File. And here's some alternate covers to the first two books. We've also been allowed by Phil's agent, his estate, and his family to write new stories set in his worlds, new fiction, starting in the Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer series of annual anthologies edited by Mike here and published by Meteor House. Is He in Hell is the first in a series of Wold Newton origins stories. This one features the Scarlet Pimpernel. It takes place in 1795 in France. And it starts to explore the question. So all of those coach passengers that were in this little tiny village in Wold Newton, pretty important kind of, wealthy people for the day. Why were they there? Why were they in Wold Newton, England? That question has never been answered. So this series of stories starts to explore why those folks were there. And I was allowed to write that first story. And then in this year's edition of the Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer, which, as Mike said, will be out in about 3 weeks, is a story called Quasin and the Bear God. So this is related, again, to that series of ancient Africa stories that Chris Carey completed the third novel for. This came from an alternate outline of that novel. And so Chris received permission to complete this as well into a novella, and it takes place within the story of the novel, The Song of Quasin, which will be published, but it's not critical to that story, so it's sort of like a side adventure that happens, and that's, again, coming up in 3 weeks. The really interesting thing, and this is my last slide, so thank you for bearing with me, and I'm going to turn it over to Rick, but the interesting thing about turning over to Art. The interesting thing about this Wold Newton continuity in this universe of shared heroes, it's starting to sort of become a phenomena to the point that publishers are interested in actually making this into a brand and a series. So The Peerless Peer, the novel that has Sherlock Holmes and the Jungle Lord that came out in the 1970s, was just reissued by Type Books in the new edition shown here. I was privileged to contribute a new afterword to this edition. And on the back cover, it says a Wold Newton Universe novel. So this is actually the first time in any book that it's been labeled a Wold Newton Universe novel. And I think the point here is that they're interested in doing more, if this one does well, and in issuing the whole series, bringing Phil's other novels and mock biographies and such back into print, under sort of a common imprint and a common brand of Wold Newton. So we're pretty excited about that. And that's it. In the interest of time, maybe we'll just do all Q&A at the end. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Art Sippo, who is a farmarian expert, a Doc Savage expert, and a pulp expert in general. Art also co-hosts the podcast, The Book Cave, which focuses a lot of attention on pulps, both classic pulps and some of the new pulp that's being written. And I think they do a little bit on comic books and so forth as well, but really focusing on the literature aspects of it. Great podcast, you should check it out.
Thank you very much, Win. I've been asked to speak on the novel A Feast Unknown, which was written by Phil Farmer. It's considered one of his more controversial masterworks, and I want to show its place in his overall life's work and its relevance to us as pulp fans. In the summer of 1969, award-winning science fiction author Philip Jose Farmer published a short novel entitled A Feast Unknown. The publisher was Essex House, which at that time specialized in publishing pornographic novels in large type fonts. It included a postscript by his fellow science fiction author Theodore Sturgeon, and the novel caused quite a stir in its time. Phil had always been an iconoclast over his entire writing career, and he was willing to take risks and to push the limits of propriety in his work. But A Feast Unknown was the most sexually explicit novel he had yet published. It also was hyper-violent and dealt with extremely controversial themes. This book was ostensibly the 9th volume in the autobiography of James Clomby, Lord Gruneth, who was clearly a pastiche of Edgar Burroughs' creation Tarzan of the Apes. His antagonist, or fellow protagonist in the story, was one Dr. James Doc Caliban, who was clearly a pastiche of the 1930s pulp hero Doc Savage. But these two characters were not like the iconic heroes upon whom they were based. Tarzan had originally been conceived by Burroughs as an exemplar of the noble savage, raised in the wild by apes apart from the corrupting influences of human society. Doc Savage, on the other hand, had been raised by scientists and other experts to be a Renaissance man, shaped by the highest ideals and knowledge available to modern civilization. They were the classic good guys, who embodied virtue, temperance, restraint, and moral rectitude, as defined from the dialectically opposed perspectives of the natural man and the civilized man. The ordinary faults and foibles of lesser men did not burden them. They were above all of that. Well, Phil Farmer decided to depict his pastiches a little more realistically. Gruneth had the mind and personality of a man who was just a hair's breadth away from a wild animal. He had no compunction about killing his enemies. He also had no hang-ups about sexuality and admitted to experimenting with masturbation, bestiality, and even homosexual activity, all of which was very shocking in the 1960s. Furthermore, he had done many things in his life that civilized people would have found disgusting, but which would have been second nature to the apes among whom he lived. Doc Caliban was depicted as a Nietzschean Superman, who exploited his physical and mental superiority to achieve whatever ends suited him with little regard for lesser human beings. In fairness, this was largely a side effect of an immortality elixir that both he and Gruneth were receiving from an ancient order of the Nine, which I think is a little tip of the hat to Talbot Mundy's Nine Unknown. And these nine are considered to be the secret rulers of the world, who for the last 30,000 years have been living immortally on the basis of this elixir. It was clear that Farmer's Doc Caliban was not the self-effacing do-gooder that Lester Dent had written about in the 1930s. In the postscript, Theodore Sturgeon opined that Farmer was doing a send-up of the pulp heroes who were undergoing a paperback renaissance at that time. As he put it, ultimate sex combined with ultimate violence is ultimate absurdity. He saw Feast as just Phil Farmer's idea of a pulp story, and many other critics agreed with this assessment. In fact, many of them were very disturbed because they thought that Phil was besmirching the character of these very venerable heroes. With several decades of perspective behind us, including a large oeuvre of Phil's subsequent work in the pulp realm, I think we need to reassess the meaning of the Feast Unknown and its place in Farmer's overall life work. Farmer's fiction had always been preoccupied by sexuality, human and otherwise. His was not a prurient concern, but more that of a biologist, an anthropologist, or a depth psychologist. He tried to portray sex as an integral part of life and of storytelling. Phil's portrayals were not clinical or merely mechanical. He tried to get behind what sexuality meant to his characters and how it functioned in his stories. Contrarily, not much of what he wrote would be considered erotic or prurient. Sex was often something that just happened to his characters in the course of the plot and was not exploited merely to titillate the reader. This attitude was present in A Feast Unknown. Gruneth's tales of sex play and bestiality before and after meeting his wife Cleo are told in a matter-of-fact way. His coupling with Trish Wilde, the cousin of Doc Caliban, and actually his cousin as well, is something that Gruneth goes at lengths to show made little or no sense in context. He's not quite sure how it happened, it just did. The casual sexual dalliances between the candidates for immortality at the stronghold of the Nine were the products of the required isolation that the Nine demanded from these people in order to show a full submission of their will to the Nine above and against all other allegiances. Even the bizarre sexual cannibalism, that is the tribute paid for the elixir of immortality, makes sense as the trading of one natural pleasure, sex, for another natural pleasure, immortality. And it should be noted that both male and female circumcision, are forms of genital mutilation, have been venerable rituals that are still practiced today by many cultures. In fact, the idea of female circumcision in several cultures in Africa and in the Islamic world was very much more extensive and graphic than what was depicted in the Feast Unknown. In many ways, the use of sexuality in Feast is typically Farmerian, albeit more explicit than what he had written previously. It is significant that in 1969, Farmer felt compelled to seek a publisher that tolerated pornography to print this. Subsequent printings of Feast for popular consumption were from more mainstream publishers, including Playboy and Dawes Books. Community standards have changed an awful lot in 40 years, and the content of Feast today would not be troublesome to most mainstream publishers. Phil was a little ahead of his time in the explicitness of what he wrote, but I think that his use of sex in his stories in general, including Feast, was consistent with his previous work. One thing that was considered very controversial at the time was the mental illness that affected both Grunneth and Caliban as a result of their taking the elixir. They would become sexually aroused with physical violence and would achieve orgasm only by killing someone. Many people were disturbed by this, yet at that time, this concept was well known among criminal psychologists and had been for over a century. It was considered to be something rare at that time. Some people, mostly men, derived sexual pleasure from torturing, raping, and killing other people. Jack the Ripper was the most notorious of these criminals, and he's been considered the first serial killer of modern times. Now, the concept of the serial killer was unknown in 1969. It became a part of public awareness in the 1970s, especially after the arrest and trial of Ted Bundy. The serial killer idea is attributed to former FBI Special Agent Robert Ressler, who was actually the basis for the character of Agent Will Grant in the Hannibal Lecter series by Tom Harris. Sadomasochistic sex play, which is another aspect of this, was something else that was not very much talked about in the 1960s and would not come to public consciousness for another decade or two. In his story, Farmer makes Grunneth and Doc Caliban the sons of Jack the Ripper by different mothers. This is no accident. He knew that the appeal of the action hero was to the reader was the vicarious thrill that it evoked in the reader by the action in the story. That thrill, in Freudian terms, was libidinous and had to have some type of sexual component. Most modern heroes like James Bond were very open about this, and they were portrayed as sexually active. Farmer wanted to point this out, albeit in an exaggeration fashion, in his reimagined pastiches, to show that an actual human being would have sexual feelings and that there would be some type of libidinous urge that would be part of their motivation. Both Tarzan and Doc Savage were portrayed as thrill-seeking adventurers. Many times, Doc Savage said so very clearly in the Super Sagas. Phil was just letting us in on a dirty little secret of what we really loved about our heroes and what would have motivated them to take such great risks. That libidinous joy of putting one's life on the line and maybe dominating or killing someone else as an act of one's own supremacy. The particular aberration that Grunneth and Doc Caliban suffer from is depicted as temporary in the story due to the elixir, but it's a direct consequence of their seeking of immortality, and I again think that is no accident. In the story, the Nine demand absolute obedience with no room for personal conscientious objection. Grunneth and Caliban loathe this aberration, but isn't it commensurate with the Faustian bargain that they've already made? They had to trade away everything in order to avoid their own deaths. Now it is only death that can give them the ultimate pleasure. In the end of the story, there's a climatic battle between these two characters, and Grunneth and Caliban decide to break with the Nine. Their bond of blood as brothers is something that they come to realize, and it begins to mean more to them than immortality itself. It is only after they realize this that the strange orgasm with killing aberration goes away. Now they regain a moral focus and direct their wrath towards the annihilation of the Nine themselves, who are the real enemy. In short, their motivation has not changed. They are still seeking the fulfillment of their natures, but it is sublimated and redirected to the deaths of specific people for a specific reason, as their ultimate desire and as their moral goal. We find similar rebellion against all powerful authorities in several of Farmer's works, including The World of Tears, River World, The Lovers, and the Day World series. Phil had a problem with conformity and the claims of absolute power by one set of human beings over another. That is why so many of his books have Ragnarok, the death of the gods, as the ultimate solution to human problems. For much of their lives, Grandrith and Doc Caliban had been directing their anger at the wrong people, in denial of whom the real enemy was. Orgasm with Killing showed them that they were misdirecting their enmity. It was actually undirected. It was going elsewhere other than where it should be. Once again, I think we can see how Phil's previous work informed this part of the plot of Feast. This brings us to the question of the Farmerian hero. As I've shown, Phil was distrustful of authority and its claims on the individual. You can see it in virtually everything he wrote, especially when that authority claimed to be ancient, venerable, and irresistible. It is no accident that the meeting room of the Nine is called the Table of the Gods, and that among the Nine are characters that seem to represent ancient deities. Odin, the father god of the Norse pantheon, is Zozas. The mother goddess of Wicca is Inanna. The trickster archetype is Iwaldi. And there is a member of the Nine quoted as, quote, a Hebrew born shortly before 1 AD who sounds suspiciously like Jesus. Every Farmerian hero, from Peter Gyrus Frigate to Two Hawks to Kikata to Hayden of Opar to Gribbardson to Jeff Caird from Dayworld to Richard Francis Burton and Sam Clemens in the Riverworld, all of them were skeptics and rebels who were not bound by social convention and who eventually take a moral stand against the powers that be. The Farmerian hero is a person of personal integrity who stands up for what he believes in and who does what he thinks is right and necessary, even when it flies in the face of convention. Grunneth clearly has Phil's greatest sympathy in Feast as a human being unsullied by social mores. Doc Caliban is a little too inhibited for Phil's case because of his civilized upbringing. And in order to completely free him from this, in the end of the novel, Grunneth, quote, kills him, and he is resurrected to a new life as a rebel against the Nine. Once again, this is a theme that runs through virtually all of Farmer's work. So we can see that Feast Unknown is not an aberration in Farmer's work, but rather typical of it. Now, there are several things in A Feast Unknown that remain somewhat shocking even today. For example, Grunneth speaks about coprophagia, the eating of animal droppings, as something that he has done in order to survive. And he goes as far as to say that in comparing various different types of animal droppings, he prefers zebra, which is, quote, almost relishable. He also describes a long-standing sexual relationship with a female leopard called Cuta, who eventually broke it off with him, in Grunneth's own words, quote, because I could not give her cubs. And who could forget that climactic image of a naked Grunneth and Doc Caliban wrestling with each other on the narrow ledge leading to the lair of the Nine. Okay, they are standing there with their erections crossed like swords as they are wrestling with each other, trying to throw each other off. Okay. Now, I think that these and other references were intended to be a playful wink from Phil Farmer. I think he's pulling our leg at that point. There was one scene at the end where Grunneth finishes off the villain Noli by making a strategic cut in his perineum and then throwing him across the room and yanking out 24 feet of intestine at the same time. This is the hyperviolent part of this stuff. Okay. Now, I can tell you as a physician, anatomically, that's not going to work. It's not that easy. But it makes a very evocative image, and I think ultimately it was intended to be humorous in a grisly sort of way. I guess that Phil thought that as long as he was pushing the envelope on 1960 standards, he might as well have a little fun with it. Phil also has Grunneth accidentally destroy a statue, if you will, a graven image, of Tarzan of the Apes that is being erected in the British town of Graceville during the climactic car chase at the end of the novel. I think this is another wink from Phil letting us know that he realizes he is deliberately destroying an idolized view of Tarzan with the story.
Just for the record, we went there too, and there is no statue.
Yeah, he did destroy it. But what no one knew in 1969 is that for several years, Phil Farmer had been a big fan of the Pulpworks. He had gotten very into the Doc Savage revival and had always been a big Tarzan fan. And in fact, he had been doing research in Burke's Peerage, trying to find the real Tarzan and to set up the various genealogies that Wynne had described. Phil later claimed that he had done this and published a series of articles with a full-blown biography of the real Tarzan based on his research. In that same book, he found links between Tarzan and Doc Savage, along with other adventure characters as we have described. This was the beginning of the Wold Newton Universe, which had become a preoccupation for many writers and fans over the years. And in fact, I've talked to a lot of people here and elsewhere who are pulp fans, and many of them tell me that reading these biographies and some of Phil's stories are what got them interested in the pulps to begin with. A Feast Unknown, therefore, has got to be seen as the first major work in what would become known as Phil Farmer's pulp period. It is obvious in retrospect that his research for the two biographies informed his writing of A Feast Unknown. In fact, the novel was clearly inspired by his research and by the messages that Phil had been conveying in his other speculative fiction all along. It is clear that Phil loved these characters, but he wanted to play with them a little bit and look at them more realistically. Now, there's a whole series of novels and short stories that Phil had done, which we've actually already seen. Wynne has gone through it all. The most important ones, of course, are Tarzan Alive and Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life. I did want to make a comment about the novel Time's Last Gift. Of course, the hero there, Gribbertson, is a very veiled Tarzan of the Apes. And Time's Last Gift, of course, the initials TLG, could stand for Tarzan Lord Grayskull. What's interesting is that the character who goes back, Gribbertson, is immortal, and he lives through 15,000 years of previous human history, taking with him the Wold Newton genes that came in 1795. So in essence, an expansion of the Wold Newton family with Gribbertson spreading the Wold Newton genes throughout history actually comes full circle and justifies the crossovers. Now, one of the questions that has arisen is, where did the title of this novel come from? And I've looked around to try and find it. I found two possible sources. The first source, at first glance, sounds unusual. It is a poem written by one of the apostles of the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints, Orson F. Whitney, which is engraved on the LDS Temple in Alberta, Canada. And when I read this, I said, this is interesting because it actually offhand deals a little bit with what was going on in A Feast Unknown. I'm going to read you the relevant section. Hearts must be pure to come within these walls, where spreads a feast unknown to festive halls. Freely partake, for freely God hath given, and taste the holy joys that tell of heaven. Here learn of him who triumphed o'er the grave, and unto men the keys the kingdom gave. Joined here by powers that past and present bind, the living and the dead perfection find. Now, interesting. But I think that it's generally accepted that there's another very short poem that was written by the American poet May Svensson. She was born in 1913 and had written a number of anthologies of love poetry, some of it explicitly erotic. She was, in fact, the chancellor of the American Association of Poets from 1980 to 1989. And this is a very short poem, and I think this is probably the one that Phil actually had in mind. In evolution strange, two tongues touch, exchange, a feast unknown to stone or tree or beast. In conclusion, A Feast Unknown was an integral part of Philip Jose Farmer's literary output, and it marked the beginning of his pulp period and of the Wold Newton universe. It was not a mere throwaway indulgence on his part in pornographic literature, but it carried on themes about human sexuality, morals, heroism, and distrust of authority that Phil had written about all of his life. I disagree with Ted Sturgeon. Phil's message was not that ultimate sex combined with ultimate violence is ultimate absurdity. Rather, I think it was that ultimate allegiance to anything, anyone, any nation, or ideology other than to one's own moral integrity is ultimate absurdity. Even the greatest heroes of popular literature, in the end, are merely human, and they too must maintain their integrity for themselves. They are sexual beings, and through sex they form allegiances of family and blood to which they must remain loyal. They cannot give up their allegiances to any external power. They must not trade their moral responsibility to anyone, even to attain the goal of eternal life. Both man in his natural state and man in most civilized state cannot shirk his moral responsibilities. Now, I'm going to be followed by Rick Lay. We've already mentioned Rick. He, in real life, he's a computer programmer, but he's also one of the most prolific and detailed commentators on the Wold Newton Universe. He also is an expert on adventure fiction in general, both in English and in other languages. Rick is one of those guys who knows just about everything about movies, books, pulps, TV shows, you name it. He is one of the 3 people who has sat down to compile a very detailed Doc Savage chronology. And he has written numerous articles and has several books in print, including his recent book, Shadows of the Opera, a collection of fiction. He has Rick Lai's Secret Histories, 2 volumes of which have been printed, Criminal Masterminds and Daring Adventures. He has a revised complete chronology of Bronze, which is in its 3rd edition, and a chronology of Shadows, a timeline of the Shadows' exploits, all of which remain in print, many of which are available downstairs. I'm going to turn things over to Rick.
Thank you all. Now, I am a writer today because of Philip Jose Farmer. I am also a pulp fan today because of Philip Jose Farmer. But I am not an uncritical admirer of Philip Jose Farmer. I think that a lot of times in the Wold Newton universe, due to publication deadlines, the lack of an internet in the 1970s, and other factors, Phil had a tendency to be run a little roughshod over the concepts of a lot of these writers, heroes he's trying to bring into the Wold Newton universe. So what I essentially do in my fiction and speculative articles is fine-tune his concepts to fit more closely to the canonical writings of the original writers. Now we're going to discuss the shadow in the pages of Philip Jose Farmer. Now just a little information about the shadow, just in case you only know the character from radio and movies. In those media, he is Lamont Cranston, a wealthy socialite. In the pulp novels, there were 2 Lamont Cranstons. One is a world-famous explorer who is rarely in the United States, and the other is an imposter, the Shadow, who has stolen Lamont Cranston's identity to hide his real identity of Kent Allard, a world-famous aviator. Okay. Now, for copyright reasons, when Phil used the Shadow in his fiction, he had to disguise him either under an alias, like in the Peerless Peer he's called Kentoff, or leave him unnamed, or simply just call him Lamont, and you would have to know this is the fake Lamont Cranston. Okay, next. Okay. Now, Wynn has already discussed the Wold Newton Universe, so we can skip this slide. Now, in Tarzan Alive, which sort of laid the foundation of the Wold Newton Universe, Philip Jose Farmer came up with a theory about who the Shadow really is. He said the Shadow, the Spider, and G8, all pulp heroes, were one man, Richard Wentworth. Now, if you know the Spider, Richard Wentworth is the true identity of the Spider. So Phil's theory at the time was this combined character was G8 during World War I, came to New York in the 1930s as in his real identity of Richard Wentworth, developed a split personality where he thought he was Kent Allard and would sometimes be the Shadow and sometimes be the Spider. Now, this theory was continued in Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life, the first hardcover edition. Next slide. What was the reaction to this theory in the pulp community? Utter rejection. People wrote letters from all over the country to Philip Jose Farmer, not buying this at all. In fact, the best attack of the theory was in a book called Gangland's Doom by Frank Eisgruber. You see 2 editions of it there. And I'm not going to go into all his objections. Most of them involve contradictions in the series. But his main argument was that the shadow and the spider could never be coexistent in any universe, in any shape or form, because they have too many contradictions, such as radically different New York police commissioners in the series, as well as the fact that in every spider novel, New York City gets totally destroyed. Meaning that not only should the Shadow not be living there, neither would Nero Wolfe, Doc Savage, or the Avenger. Okay, next slide. Now, in the paperback edition of Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life, Philip Jose Farmer revised his theory. A man named Stephen Powers, who was a Pope fan, wrote to him and said, you know, what you really should have done was make the Shadow and the Spider brothers. Since the Shadow precedes the Spider, he should be the older brother. And the Spider got jealous and then became a vigilante crime fighter who meticulously copied him as his sibling rival. And Phil Farmer looked at that and said he has to build on what he wrote before, so the only way he could make that work was to make Wentworth the older brother and the Shadow the younger brother. Okay, next one. Now, as a Pope, looking over the adventures, I can't buy that theory because it doesn't address the central objections raised by Frank Eisgruber. Spider and the Shadow is still incompatible. But it had one good idea in it. It made the Shadow and G8 members of the Rassendyll family from Anthony Hope's The Prisoner of Zenda. Now, if you're not familiar with that novel, it involves a man named Rudolph Rassendyll, who's an Englishman, who is the cousin of a Central European monarch called the King of Ruritania, and because they're cousins, they look exactly alike. And Rassendyll impersonates the king in that novel. That is a little like the 2 Lamont Cransons. It's probably not where Walter Gibson got the idea, but it's close enough. Now, when Philip Jose Farmer wrote The Adventure of the Peerless Peer, he reflected that idea in that he has Sherlock Holmes go on this World War I mission. He's flown part of the way by G8 and the other part of the way by the Shadow under aliases. And a British general midway through the flights is saying, both these pilots come from a noble British family that has royal blood in them. So that is supposed to be the Rassendyll family, even though it is not explicitly stated in the novel. Now, there is a footnote that G8 has a half-brother named Wentworth somewhere. But there is no reference that says Wentworth is the half-brother of the Shadow. So my modification of this theory, which was in my book Daring Adventurers, was that the Shadow and G8 are really cousins, that they're both members of the Rassendyll family, and Wentworth is only G8's brother, and there's no biological relationship to the Shadow at all. Now, I've written a series of short stories called Shadows of the Opera, which involves a romance between 2 characters. One is the father of Maurice Leblanc's Arsène Lupin, who Walter Gibson acknowledged as a major influence of the Shadow, and the other is a woman who belongs to the Rassendyll family. So that will be how G8 and the Shadow were really connected. Next slide. Now, even though I reject the theory, in fairness, there were other people in Pope fandom who loved it. And one was a fellow named Joe Lewandowski, who was a great friend of mine and helped inspire me to be a writer. And he wrote an article called The Updated Farmer under the pseudonym of Bees Benz in a Pope fanzine called Nemesis Incorporated. And he loved the idea so much, he didn't just want 3 brothers, he wanted 5 brothers. So he threw in the Phantom Detective and the Green Llama. Now this was Joe having fun, I don't know if Phil Farmer ever read this. He certainly never accepted it in any of his writings. Okay, next slide. Now, Philip Jose Farmer wants to have a little fun here. Now, this is a short story called Showdown and a Shootout, which is really not part of the Wold Newton universe. It contradicts too much. It's really sort of an alternate universe of crossovers. And in this story, it's involving a character named Greatheart Silver, who's a descendant of Long John Silver from Treasure Island, who gets involved with every pulp hero imaginable, who appear under pseudonyms. Doc Savage is Doc Ravage. The Shadow is Fenwick Promptly, a name which always drives me crazy. It was derived from some alias the Shadow occasionally used in Walter Gibson's novels. They all get together and fight nearly every pulp villain in fiction, from Herr Dr. Kluger, the Fu Manchu, the Yensing, Wu Fang, the Octopus, you name it. And they all have this big battle, and everybody dies except Greatheart Silver, which, from an artistic point of view, seems to me extremely unfair. Philip Jose Farmer's creation is the only one left standing. I kind of felt he should die in the novel. So, if you feel the same way as I do, read The Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer, #1, Protean Dimensions, which is an authorized continuation in which Greatheart Silver finally dies. Next slide. Maybe. Hold that. Okay. Now, in Savage Shadow, which is another sort of alternate universe crossover story, which involves the publishing world. Now, in the publishing world, The Shadow was written by Walter Gibson under Maxwell Grant, which allowed, under the pseudonym of Maxwell Grant, which allowed the publisher Street Smith to sometimes throw in another writer to write a Shadow if they wanted to. And Kenneth Robeson was used as a pseudonym primarily by Lester Dent and now by Will Murray to write Doc Savage stories, and it was also used, the name Kenneth Robeson, to mask Paul Ernst as the author of The Avenger. So in this alternate universe, Maxwell Grant and Kenneth Robeson are real people, and all of those other writers don't exist. And the central premise of the story was Jimmy Dale, who was a pulp vigilante from the 1920s, who was a forerunner, actually, of The Shadow, hires Maxwell Grant to write a fictional story of how Kenneth Robeson created Doc Savage in The Avenger. Now let's examine this concept for a moment. In this alternate universe, if Kenneth Robeson and Maxwell Grant are real people, the following literary giants don't exist: Walter Gibson, Lester Dent, Paul Ernst, and Will Murray. Now, since Will has mysteriously disappeared, I fear that he may have been sucked into an alternate universe. Next slide. The Henry Miller Dawn Patrol is a comedy involving World War I veterans in a nursing home. And they fondly remember that the Shadow was a great World War I ace. Now, in Walter Gibson's novel, it was mentioned in his novels, the Shadow sometimes uses the alias of the Black Eagle during World War I. It's also known as the Dark Eagle. And as a sort of in-joke, the inmates of the nursing home call an African-American employee who works there the Black Eagle. Next slide. Okay. Now, Philip Jose Farmer wanted to create a Son of the Shadow. And he wrote a story called Skinburn, which stars Kent Lane, a private eye. Now, if you read that story in the book of Philip Jose Farmer, in the multiple editions, you'll see a little introduction by Phil which says, Kent Lane owns a fire opal ring, which is supposed to be the Shadow's ring, and his parents were unmarried. Now, if you read it in some other reprints, like the recent Subterranean Press Up the Bright River, you'll see that introduction is missing, so you don't see any mention that he has the fire opal ring. But there is a story that will be appearing in The Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer #2, called For the Articles by Brad Sinar, which will involve the fire opal ring and be an authorized continuation of Kent Lane. Now, don't shake it. Okay. Now, let's look at this a little bit. Probably, if you read the shadow, Kent Lane is supposed to be the mother of Margot Lane, the faithful companion of the shadow. Now, she has a little interesting history. She wasn't created for the pulp magazines originally. She popped up in 1937 on radio, and then Walter Gibson got this directive in 1940, included her in the novels. So suddenly she appears miraculously as an agent of the shadow without any explanation of the pulp readers. She then appears in about 30 novels afterwards, and Walter Gibson says, yeah, I better explain where she came from. So he wrote this little origin that she was on a Caribbean cruise, met the real Lamont Cranston, and then met the fake Lamont Cranston in New York City 2 days later, and something happened that made her an agent of the shadow. It was enough to get by, but it's still a little bit. Now, Margot Lane probably never kissed the shadow in any of Walter Gibson's novels, so it's still highly unlikely that they had an affair. The woman that Philip Jose Farmer should have gone after in the Shadow's works was a woman named Thelda Blanchette. She only appears in one novel. It's The Death Tower, January 1932, was written in the summer of 31. And she was the first love interest for the Shadow. The Shadow actually kissed her on the lips. The Shadow actually really digged her and romanced her. And she had an incredibly scandalous background. She was the thief and the mistress of a master criminal. So if Philip Jose Farmer wanted to have somebody controversial be the mother of Kent Lane, who would fit better, he should have chosen Thelda Blanchette. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is, I told you earlier I like to revise Philip Jose Farmer's theories. So it was incredible logic. I'm about to transform Thelda Blanchette into Margot Lane, at least the Margot Lane of Philip Jose Farmer. Now, it's said here that that Kent Lane has a fire opal ring. Now, the Shadow in the world of Walter Gibson had two fire opal rings. Both came from the eyes of an idol in Guatemala. Now, which of those rings could it be? My suspicion is that it is neither ring, because Walter Gibson wrote a short story called The Purple Girasol. Fire opals are also called purple girasols, which Anthony Tolan found recently and printed in Shadow, Sanctum's books reprint Shadow number 28, which is Master of Death and the Rackets King. And that story involves a fire opal which is cursed. Now, is there any evidence that Kent Lane is suffering from a curse? In Skinburn, two of his girlfriends died in horrible car accidents over a period of 4 months. And the explanation given for these horrible accidents is that a computer miraculously gained artificial intelligence, fell in love with Kent Lane, and murdered the two women out of jealousy. Now, as a computer programmer, I can tell you that that could only happen through black magic. So therefore, I think Kent Lane has the third purple girasol, which is cursed. Now, what happened to the third purple girasol at the end of that story? It was in the property of a man named Roger. Now, in the story, in the novel which featured Thelda Blanchette, she steals all the possessions of a man named Roger. So you can make a theory right here that she must have stolen the third purple girasol. Okay, next slide. Now, one of the best stories written by Philip Jose Farmer is called After King Kong Fell. It has the death of King Kong being witnessed by three important people. One is Doc Savage, who rides up in a car. The other is a hawk-faced man who's accompanied by a woman named Margot. Now, they're supposed to be the shadow posing as Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane. And this all happens in New York during 1931. Now, the problem here is chronological. Margot Lane wasn't working with the shadow in 1931 in the works of Wally Gibson. She only got involved with the shadow around 1940. Therefore, this woman can't be Margot Lane. So how do I resolve that? Well, the central premise of the Shadow series is that Kent Allard impersonates Lamont Cranston while he's living abroad. Well, couldn't a woman be impersonating Margot Lane if she was living abroad? Is there any evidence that Margot Lane is living abroad? She entered the series from the Caribbean, according to Wally Gibson, so she could easily have been living in the Caribbean from 1931 to 1940. Now, Velda Blanchett in the novel The Death Tower escapes totally unscathed and is wanted by the police for robbing this guy Roger. So you would have a logical reason to assume another identity of somebody who really exists. So therefore, I think Velda Blanchett is impersonating Margot Lane in all the works of Philip Jose Farmer. Next slide. Now we come to the most controversial story ever written by Philip Jose Farmer about the shadow, The Long Wet Purple Dream of Rip Van Winkle. This is a radical rewrite of Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. Now, to briefly summarize Irving's story. Rip Van Winkle is a man who in the 1770s goes up into the Catskill Mountains, meets some strange group of people, drinks some unusual liquor, wakes up 20 years later in the 1790s, and he's an old man. Now, what Philip Jose Farmer does is that he has Rip Van Winkle travel through time during those 20 years to 3 points in the 20th century. Rip travels to the age of the shadow, 1972 and 1987. We don't need to worry about the last 2 points in time, but let's discuss the first. First of all, let's determine what year it is. In the story, when Rip encounters the shadow, there is a flask of gin, which is the worst liquor available. That suggests Prohibition, which ended in December 5th, 1933. There was also playing on a car radio, the Lone Ranger. And car radios were invented in 1930, and the Lone Ranger appeared on radio for the first time February 2nd, 1933. Therefore, the year of the story is 1933. Which makes it impossible for the woman to be Wally Gibson's Margot Lane. Now, what happens in the story is that Rip sees this woman who's smoking a cigarette alone in a car, and they have a conversation, and she reveals that she is the faithful and constant companion of a vigilante who is always leaving her alone in cars so he can run off in a hat and cloak and shoot crooks. And she feels horribly neglected. She claims never to have had sex with the guy throughout their entire dating relationship. And in order to compensate for this lack of attention, he then has sex with Rip Van Winkle. Okay. This isn't exactly acceptable to Walt Gibson fans. So, the most likely explanation is this is again Velda Blanchett impersonating Margot Lane. The impersonation must have gone for at least 2 years, 1931 to 1933. And the important concept here is Philip Jose Farmer had his version of Margot Lane say she never had sex with the shadow, which sort of contradicts Skinburn. So the logical conclusion is that Kent Lane must be the son of Rip Van Winkle. Therefore, this poor boy has been lied to all his life. His mother has told him she's Margot Lane. She's given him an imitation shadow ring with a cursed purple girasol, and his father is Rip Van Winkle. And that concludes my presentation.
I guess, any questions?
Yeah, I had a whole laundry list of questions for you guys. I just want to say first, I really want to thank you guys for being here and the Pulpfest people for having you, and I hope you keep doing this again. It's just a pity that this got shoved into the wee hours of the morning. I really appreciate going to a con where people talk about books, as you said. That's very important, and I was delighted to hear you comment about Great Heart Silver versus the Wold series, and the fact there's going to be more Eden of Ancient Opar books. I mean, that was my big question for you guys. But I guess there's two questions, maybe three, that I really want to ask you. In view of all the things that Farmer did, playing with various versions of Tarzan, when it came time to ask the Herb Estate, which is very jealous of its prerogatives, for permission to do Tarzan Alive and or the authorized novel, were they reluctant and or did they put any restrictions on him? The other question I'm going to ask is based on my blundering into this critical, this magazine of criticism about science fiction. It may have been Foundations, which is published in Britain, and there was an article by George Zabrowski in which he was very, very critical of Philip Jose Farmer. I don't know if you gentlemen are familiar with it or not. He had some extremely unkind things to say about him, which he summarized with saying that he had a great deal of talent, but his imagination frequently outran his talent. And I just looked at that in some wonder. Then I went over to my hardcover bookcase, pulled out the best of Philip Jose Farmer, I think it was, which was published like 2 or 3 years after this article and was edited by George Zabrowski. I was wondering if you gentlemen know if there was a confrontation and or a reconciliation between these two guys. The last one is that there was a comic book or a graphic novel that said Tarzan and John Carter, Warlords of Mars. Was that another take on the Tarzan of Mars idea, which Ray Palmer had authorized, but Herb's Estate had not authorized back in the 50s? I bought a bootleg copy. I'd heard of it 40 years ago. I bought a copy about 10 years ago. Did Philip Jose Farmer ever think of or attempt to do something like that himself, and was that something he had done or was linked to in any way? That's a lot for you to talk about, so I'll just shut up now.
So there were 3 questions there, and I'll briefly address the first and the third. I can't address the second one. So your first question was, how difficult was it for Phil to get permission to do Tarzan Alive originally, and then to do the authorized Dark Heart of Time novel, which came out in 1999. So I don't recall anything from the files, Mike, about correspondence between Phil or Phil's agent from the early 70s about Tarzan Alive book. We do know that they did approve of that book, but we don't have any correspondence for that. Regarding the authorized novel, which came out in 1999, I think that Phil had lobbied and negotiated for that privilege for a long time. So we know that, like you said, ERB jealously guards its trademarks and copyrights. And but I think that in recognition of Phil's contributions to Tarzan mythos and Tarzan fandom for decades and decades, they allowed him to write the novel. I will say that one of the things that's pretty clear is that they retain the copyright to that novel. So whereas with the Doc Savage novel that he wrote, which came out in 1991, Phil and thus Phil's estate actually owned the copyright to Escape from Loki. But with the Tarzan book, the ERB folks own the copyright to that Tarzan novel. Mike, I don't know if you can add anything. If you can, great. Otherwise, I'm going to move to question number 3.
No, I can't.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, think of anything to add to that.
All right. So question number 3 was a cover scan of Tarzan and John Carter, Warlords of Mars. It was a 4-issue comic miniseries that came out from Dark Horse Comics in 1996, I think. Mid-1990s, anyway. And to answer your question, no, it is actually not related to Tarzan on Mars by John Bloodstone, otherwise known as Stuart. I'm sorry, it's almost 1 a.m. Yeah. So you're right. Tarzan on Mars was written, in I think early 1950s, and then ERB killed it. And the Tarzan and John Carter, Warlords of Mars, may have, obviously some similar themes, in terms of Tarzan going to Barsoom, but it's not based on that novel. And I can say that because I have the bootleg. So. In terms of question number 2, I actually have not heard about that at all, Mike.
Yeah, I'm not, off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with that article. And I have several issues of Foundation that have articles about Phil, including, I think there's one by Franz Rottensteiner, that's very critical of Phil. He was critical of everybody who wasn't named Stanislaw Lem. So, but no, I will definitely be looking for that, because for the website I've collected every article that mentions Phil at all that I'm aware of.
I could scan it for you and send it to you if you give me an email address or a card.
I will do that.
I was just fascinated by it because it was just such an amazing turnaround.
And I also didn't realize that George Zabrowski had anything to do with the best of Philip Jose. Was it the book of Philip Jose Farmer? Or?
Well, what's something like it's in like 5 years since I encountered the one and then went to look at the other. Which one did he do on Philip Jose Farmer? Any gentlemen remember? He did.
Was it the classic Philip Jose Farmer?
Maybe it was the classic. There were 2 volumes of
Right.
the classic.
Yeah.
He may have been involved in that.
Yeah, I will look it up.
So yeah, if you could scan that and send it. By the way, it's really easy to reach either Mike or myself. Mike is mike@pjfarmer.com. And I'm Win, W-I-N, at pjfarmer.com.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
And I think I saw some other hands earlier. Okay, I guess we'll stick in the front row for a moment.
I had first a question and a comment. A friend of mine who's a mutual friend of some of your guys, Henry Zio Covert, he was on the far right in the Farmercon 2 picture.
Yeah.
He said that meeting Phil was a revelatory experience. Would you guys say the same?
I first read my first farmer book in 1975 when I was 8 years old. It was Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life. So it was a Wold Newton book, and you can see, what happened to me, right? So it's an illness, right? But it's a good illness.
Right.
And to finally meet Phil, 30 years later, it was a dream come true. And they say when, maybe you should be careful about meeting your heroes because maybe they're not really that nice in person. Phil was extremely gracious, extremely generous, had us into their house, that objected when we said, we'll go out and get food, that he's like, no, we'll make you food. And, these are elderly people wanting to take care, of us. A revelatory experience, I don't know how to frame that experience into words yet. Really, I can't, because it's reading Phil's books and being involved in this has been such a huge part of my life.
Right. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, and revelatory, that's an interesting way of putting it, because when I first started doing the Farmer website, I actually went to a book signing of his at RiverCon in 1995, and within a year I started doing the website, really just because I have such a bad memory. I wanted to write down the name of the stories and a little description of them so I could remember which ones they were. And I started putting it online, and after telling him about it and showing it to him, I've just never wanted to stop. I just want to keep doing it for him, I spent thousands and thousands of dollars buying every fanzine I could find with an article by him or about him, magazines just for the book reviews. We have like 300 and something reviews on the website. And eventually I got to the point where I would call book dealers and say, I could give you $10 for that issue of Astounding, but I'll give you $2 if you'll just scan the book review and email it to me. So, I started doing that, and for whatever reason, I haven't really made any money doing any of this. It's just been a labor of love. Even doing Farmer File, the magazine, for 15 issues over 5 years. Was a lot of work went into that, and a lot of contacting people and saying, hey, I know you're a farmer fan. Would you write something for us? And over those issues of Farmer File, if you look at how many people were in those, how many people did cover art and interior art and wrote articles, and they all did it for free. Nobody got paid a dime. I sent them 2 copies of the magazine and sent Phil and his wife Betty all the money we made from selling the magazine. So that was, they didn't need the money. They were fine, but that was, he's a writer and you should get paid for writing. I firmly believe that. So, although I did get all those people to write for free, but they did that for Phil, not for me. So, yeah, it's just something about the man that makes you want to do things for him once you've met him. And just a really,
never got the chance.
Just a really quick thing. The first time I went to his house was to interview him for the website, and then the following year I said I'm coming back up to Peoria for this Mid-America Book and Paper Fair he did every year to get more books signed. And they said, well, are you staying overnight? Do you need a place to stay? You can come stay at the house. Wow, okay, fantastic. I'll stay at the house. And I get there and we're eating dinner, and Betty says, oh, by the way, we both have doctor's appointments, so when you wake up in the morning, we won't be here. And I'm thinking, are you guys crazy? You've met me twice before, once before I came to the house, and you're just leaving me alone in your home. They were just such wonderful people that, you just want to do anything for them. Interesting question.
One thing, back in 1969, the very first Philip Jose Farmer book I read was A Feast Unknown, which is cutting your teeth on something pretty hard to begin with. I was almost 16 at the time. And what had attracted it to me was the cover with a naked Doc Savage and an obviously naked Tarzan wrestling each other in front. And I just couldn't pass that up. I was the world's biggest Doc Savage fan in the 60s. And I didn't think anybody else really was paying much attention. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have a lot of the network people we have now. And what really struck me is that as Phil's oeuvre unfolds, he starts doing Lord Tiger, and then Tarzan Live, and then the Doc Savage biography, and all these other books that get involved in the Wold Newton Universe. He was hitting all kinds of things that had been my favorites for years. He had the same preoccupations that I did. Things that meant something to me meant something to him. And I was able to meet Phil briefly on that last Farmercon 90. He was not really in any condition to talk, but being in the presence of the man who shared so many things with me that was so important was really a very moving experience. And another thing that I have to say, Phil and Betty were the power couple in science fiction. They had been married for 60 years, was it? Something like this. They'd been joined at the hip. And despite all of the themes that Phil has going through his books, all right, he was a relatively speaking conventional person. He was a good husband. He was a good father. He was a good grandfather. He was actually a very nice man. And everybody who knew him said the same thing. So, it was fun not only meeting the guy whose imagination went along with me, but to find out that he was as nice a person as he was.
I first met Philip Jose Farmer at a Pulpfest. I'm not sure when the exact year was. I think it was probably early 90s. And I said in reverence as he appeared at a panel like this, interviewed by Don Hutchinson, going through all his writings. Unfortunately, when I visited his house, he wasn't in good health, so I spent more time learning about his wife, who I had hardly talked to at Pulpfest, who was an extraordinary lady, Betty Farmer.
Two quick ones. There was a book up there, The Empire of the Nine. What was that? And also, what is the spider's position in Wold Newton, given the fact that New York City's a story get involved almost everything?
So Empire of the Nine is the British collection of, actually Feast is not included.
Oh, it's the
There's
Mad
two
Goblin.
subsequent books, The Lord of the Trees and The Mad Goblin. Both of which, by the way, and Art didn't touch on this, those are follow-up Lord Grunneth and Doc Caliban novels that actually are not, that don't have the sexual explicit, because that's resolved in Feast Unknown.
Right.
But they're continuing adventures. And then in terms of the spider, you probably get varying questions on that. I think Rick would probably say the spider, he thinks the spider is not part of the Wold Newton Universe. I think Rick can speak for himself. My position is that Spider's adventures are highly fictionalized, and really exaggerated versions of some sort of real events, real spider events that take place in the Wold Newton Universe.
I've never written this in an article, but you either have to do one of two things with the spider. You either have to have an Earth 1, Earth 2 concept like DC Comics has, and you have to put it in an alternate parallel universe. But if you wanted to make him exist in compatibility with all the other pulp heroes, you'd have to say that he stayed in India in those two little short stories that Norval Page wrote as an origin story with the spider and never came to New York.
Do any of your Farmer File fanzines that you have on sale downstairs have any Opar, Hayden of Ancient Opar articles, or are there any on your website? That's the first one. And this gentleman here, your essay that you read on Feast Unknown, are you publishing that, or is that on a website?
No, that's just something I made up for this, but
It's really good. You should publish it or put it on a website.
I've got a blog, Speculations in Bronze, which I periodically put things up. Maybe what I'll do is I'll polish it up and I'll put it on there.
Art came to a previous Farmercon when we all, basically, a whole bunch of people got up and talked about, was that what Phil Farmercon, or was that a different one?
Yeah.
And his was the one article that stood out that I asked him, hey, can we publish this in Farmer File? So every time he gets up and talks like this, people are like, hey, where are you going to publish that? So, and to answer the question about Farmer File, off the top of my head, I know that issue 12, which is sold out, unfortunately, had a lot of, had Opar in it, but issue 9, which we do still have some, had some Opar in it, I believe.
Yeah.
By Chris Carey, the guy who's completed the third novel. So he wrote several things about Opar for Farmer File while he was doing the research. So to finish the novel. So yeah, come see me about that.
Yeah, come down to the table tomorrow and we'll look through the issues. There's also in one of the issues, and it may be in number 12 or maybe 13. There's a Sahindar John Gribbertson timeline. So it basically takes all of the events and then he goes back in time and then lives 12,000 years as an immortal through time. And then I just wanted to say a little bit about Art's comments on A Feast Unknown. I was thinking the exact same thing to you as I was listening to Art give his presentation. And if there's any chance at all that Titan Books, as I mentioned, they're interested in doing sort of a Wold Newton branded series. If they have any interest at all in publishing A Feast Unknown and the subsequent books, I'm definitely going to recommend Art's essay to them as either a new forward or a new afterword.
I believe the gentleman
was there ever an outline or anything of a follow-up story to the Lord of the Trees or the Mad Goblin? Because at the end of those two novels, it's clearly intimated that there was going to be an epic battle
Right.
to follow that. Did he ever do anything in that?
So at the 1983, I think it was World Fantasy Convention, Phil actually had a chapter in the convention program and a bit of a speech. So he gave a speech and he spoke about a follow-up book, and then he read a chapter from that projected book. The book was called, was to be called, The Monster on Hold, and it's Dr. Caliban focused, and basically says that there were some events that took place regarding Doc Caliban in the 1970s, in the late 70s, about 77 or so, and then the action jumps forward to 1983, which is contemporaneous when Phil wrote this fragment of A Monster on Hold. In going through the magic filing cabinet, we unearthed another chapter from this called Down to Earth Center. Again, Doc Caliban centered. In this piece, this chapter was reprinted in Farmer File 13,
Near
maybe.
the end.
We have it downstairs in one of the issues.
If it's in 15, we have it downstairs.
If it was in 12,
13
12
or
is sold
14,
out.
they're also allowed.
Okay. But we can look that up. That's actually on pjfarmer.com. All of the contents for all 15 issues of Farmer File are listed on the pjfarmer.com website. So that fragment exists, and then the Monster on Hold fragment exists. And then there's some notes and so forth. And I don't think that the two fragments are irreconcilable. I think something could be done with them.
Just one comment. The outline indicated a disguised sequel to Up From Earth Center, the last Doc Savage novel in which he apparently goes to the gates of hell. And it was supposed to explain that with a sort of Lovecraftian type explanation, not necessarily Cthulhu, but whatever exists that is the basis for Cthulhu in form of fiction.
I also forgot to mention that the World Fantasy fragment from 1983, The Monster on Hold, was reprinted in my book Myths for the Modern Age, which was the first screenshot that you saw in my presentation. So I do have copies of that downstairs. Wasn't it also reprinted in Pearls from Peoria? So Pearls from Peoria was another 1,000-page omnibus of farmer books. And then a really interesting thing about the Monster on Hold fragment is that when Doc Caliban is down in the depths of the caves that he goes back to from Up From Earth Center, the Doc Savage novel, he sees across a shimmering gate his other. He sees the other. And I take that to mean that Doc Caliban is seeing a reflection across an alternate universe gate of Doc Savage. So, we talked about the real Tarzan and the real Doc Savage, sort of the Caliban grown-up, and I see this as Doc Caliban seeing Doc Savage.
If I may make one more comment. When I read that, I actually kind of reached the same conclusion. I was pleased when you sort of referenced that in one of your stories for Tales of the Shadow Man. I thought that was very cool. I know I told you that in an email at the time, Lynn, but...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I referenced that in my Tales of the Shadow Man story in volume number 5, Iron and Bronze. Well, there's one gentleman way in the back that's been patiently waiting.
I just had a question regarding, with any of your discussion with Farmer, did he ever give his intent or what he was thinking about when he wrote Please Don't Know?
Art, you probably
Analyzed by
talked to him.
Well, at the time I met him, we really weren't able to communicate very well. It's interesting. I think we can infer a lot of things just by looking at subsequent work that he did in the area. And I also think that the incident I mentioned where the statue of Tarzan and the Apes is basically destroyed by him in the car chase, I think that that's another symbol of what was going on. Phil was somebody who had very little patience with hypocrisy and with all of the masks that we put on ourselves. The Unreasoning Mask was the title of probably his most philosophical novel, and that's one of his concerns. And I think he really loved these pulp characters. He felt that they were archetypal. He's very explicit about that in the Doc Savage biography. And I think his intention with The Feast Unknown was to take these characters and, number one, deal with them as real people. You know, what would, if you really were raised by wolves, what would you be like? Okay, if you were raised by apes, what would you be like? If you really were a hyper-civilized individual who's been trained in all these various different disciplines and you're superior to everyone else, how would you respond to other people? You know, the do-gooder aspects of the pulp heroes was probably overstated, and Phil wanted to get in there and say, well, let's look at it a little more realistically. I think he also recognized something that is much more commonly accepted now than it was at that time, and that's that human sexuality in particular is something that is normative, it's part of human life, it's part of the plot. It's not, you know, you don't have to be prurient about it, but you have to understand what it means and how it functions. And I think he wanted to explore that particular aspect of these characters. That's what he's explored in so many of his stories, where he talks about the dynamics of sexuality. So his intention was, with all of his researches and all of his love, he wanted to take these characters, and I think he wanted to make them Farmerian heroes. I think that was the intention. Lord Grunneth is a natural Farmerian hero because he's not tainted with society. Caliban has to go through death and resurrection for that to happen. And you know, I think that's what he was trying to do, was to bring them into his sphere and make them comprehensible in his own worldview.
I really liked Lord Tiger. I thought that was a very interesting character and just an overall concept for a book. Where do you guys place that? Do you think it's a standalone story? Could it be part of Wold Newton? Or could it be in with A Feast Unknown, even?
The question was about Phil's novel Lord Tiger, in which basically there's an experiment to create a Tarzan. And the question was, you know, where would that fit? Could it fit in the Wold Newton universe or the Feast Unknown universe? At this point, I think it could be either one. I don't recall any specific links that he or any hints that he injected saying it could be one or the other. You guys recall?
Yeah, I don't remember.
He never mentions it again in any of the continuities, and it's another aspect of this question of what do you do when you're raised by apes and animals. There's a collection of essays he had called "Mother Was a Lovely Beast," which included some essays and also some short stories about other feral humans raised by animals written by other people, some of which were very interesting. But I think Lord Tiger was intended to be kind of a standalone, and to highlight some of the other themes that had gone through his mind. You know, in the story, there are actually three brothers that are brought into this environment, one of whom doesn't survive, one of whom is raised by real apes and can't talk and is not able to communicate as a human being. And so they have to create a very artificial environment with midgets, basically, or little people is the proper term. Little people acting as if they were apes in order to raise them so that you have linguistic skills and other things. What Phil was doing there is he was actually using what knowledge they had at the time of how human beings develop, and to show that the whole idea of a feral child coming up as a noble savage doesn't make any sense. He needed to have some type of human companionship, and he goes through there. I don't think it really fits into the other stories. It makes its own points. And again, it's the same problem. The guy who actually runs the whole show is like Christoph in that movie with Jim Carrey. What's the movie where Jim Carrey is the Truman Show. Okay, he's Christoph in the Truman Show. Okay, it's just the Nine all over again. It's the Lords of the Tears all over again. It's the Lords of Dayworld all over again. The all-powerful person who's controlling your destiny, and it's the rebellion of man against fate.
There was a question way in the back.
Yeah, at the time that the Feast Unknown was published, that was in the same era where we saw, for example, Night of the Living Dead, which was controversial at the time because it had the black lead hero, sensitive subject in that period. My question is, with this in mind, is Farmer kind of unique as far as stepping out of the mold of the action theme and writing as kind of a social critique, or do other writers kind of come to mind, you know, in earlier eras that did the same thing? Critics of, you know, social themes, social problems of earlier periods, or could it be said maybe that Farmer was, you know, sort of an early, you know?
I think Farmer was riffing on himself from the Lovers in 1952. So he was always breaking ground, and he broke ground in the 50s with the Lovers. And I don't think he was out to try to top himself, but I think he was just always looking for, you know, what was next, what could he tackle next. So I wouldn't want to say that other writers didn't do that, you know, at all. But I think that Phil's approach to it was definitely unique and groundbreaking.
And one of the things about Feast that made it very controversial was not just a lot of the shocking material he put in, but he took some iconic characters and basically pared them down. And that was something that nobody had really done in the pastiche, not to that degree. So, you know, again, he was ahead of his time with a lot of that stuff. He was taking a lot of risk. And the thing that's amazing, I reread A Feast Unknown recently just to get ready to give the talk. I was surprised at how short the novel was. It's only about 150 pages. I was surprised about actually how tame it appears based upon current standards, both in novels and in theater. You know, some of the language I found very shocking back when I was 16, but, you know, right now it isn't. Some of the stuff, you know, the idea of gaining nutrition from the droppings of animals, there are people who actually do that on a regular basis in the third world. And with Phil's reading, I'm sure he knew that. There's nothing really he talks about in the book, as I look back at it now with the 4 decades of perspective. There's nothing there that really wasn't really known. It's just that people didn't talk about it, and it was not in the public consciousness. But there were a lot of people who did social satire. Some of it very biting. You know, we can think of several folks. Aldous Huxley did biting satire. H.G. Wells did some of that. Oh gosh, there are several classic authors back in the 1930s, 40s, and even in the previous century who did that.
You should mention Burroughs, because Burroughs had a lot of disguise and social criticism. Tarzan and the Ant-Man discusses prohibition and this, you know, how they handle alcohol in an ant society. You got communism critiqued in Pirates of Venice and the Moon Maid, and Nazism criticized in Carson of Venus. So there was a lot of disguised commentary.
I guess my point is that we tend to look at the genre mainly as action, and less where, you know, as I say, where they're kind of writing metaphorically, kind of subverting certain things. Certainly, I would guess subversive probably by the things at the times you say. While today, certainly Mavericks did. Right. Thank you.
Questions? Well, thank you very much for hanging in there. We really appreciate it. We'll see you later today.